Have you ever felt like expensive solutions don't always work? This billionaire father spent $250,000 on 5 different therapists for his traumatized son, and none of them could break through. Contrary to what most people believe, the person who finally helped this 6-year-old boy heal wasn't a renowned child psychologist with advanced degrees. It was the black woman who cleaned his father's office at night and understood that sometimes silence speaks louder than words. I've studied hundreds of cases where traditional therapy fails, but this story reveals something that will challenge everything you think you know about healing trauma. By the end of this story, you'll understand why listening is not passive, but the most active form of love, and how one janitor's simple presence accomplished what $250,000 in professional therapy couldn't. Nina Roberts went from being an overlooked cleaning lady to the woman who saved a child's emotional life, proving that healing doesn't come from techniques or credentials. It comes from someone brave enough to witness pain without trying to fix it. If you skip this story, you'll miss the moment that shows why presence is more powerful than any therapy method ever invented, and how the most profound healing happens in the quietest moments. The 47th floor of Walsh Pharmaceuticals gleamed with the kind of sterile perfection that suggested unlimited resources and controlled environments. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Chicago's skyline, while the executive offices hummed with the quiet efficiency of a company worth $12 billion. But in the corner office where CEO Thomas Walsh conducted business that affected millions of patients worldwide, the most important healing he needed to accomplish was happening much closer to home. His 6-year-old son Ethan sat in the corner of that office, surrounded by toys that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, staring at nothing with the hollow expression of a child who had seen too much, too young. Have you ever felt like expensive solutions don't always work? This story will show you why. Thomas Walsh had learned the devastating truth that money couldn't purchase peace of mind, safety, or the return of childhood innocence once it had been stolen by violence. 18 months earlier, their Lincoln Park mansion had been invaded by 3 armed men seeking the rare pharmaceutical samples that Thomas occasionally brought home for research purposes. What they found instead was a family dinner interrupted by terror, a mother who tried to protect her child, and a 6-year-old boy who watched his world explode into violence and chaos. The physical injuries had healed quickly. Thomas's wife Claire had recovered from her concussion and broken ribs within weeks. The security system had been upgraded. The samples moved to a secure facility, and the perpetrators arrested and prosecuted. But Ethan's emotional wounds had only deepened with time, creating a chasm between the bright, curious boy he'd been and the silent, hypervigilant child he'd become. Thomas had approached his son's trauma the same way he approached every challenge in his pharmaceutical empire, with the best expertise money could buy and the systematic application of proven methodologies. Dr. Sarah Chen had been the first specialist, a renowned play therapist from Northwestern, with publications in 3 major journals and a waiting list that typically extended 6 months. She'd cost $50,000 over 4 months, utilizing structured play sessions designed to help children process traumatic experiences through controlled activities. Ethan had participated with the mechanical compliance of a child who understood that adults expected certain behaviors from him. He'd moved toys according to Dr. Chen's gentle guidance, created scenarios in the dollhouse that she'd analyzed for symbolic meaning, and completed every session without protest or engagement. After 16 weeks, Dr. Chen had recommended a different approach. Dr. Michael Torres, the EMDR specialist from Rush University Medical Center, had been the second attempt. His $60,000 treatment protocol involved eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing, a technique proven effective for trauma survivors across age groups. Ethan had endured 12 sessions of following lights and sounds while recalling fragments of the invasion, his small body growing more rigid with each appointment. The sessions had ended when Ethan began having nightmares that were worse than anything he'd experienced before the treatment began. Dr. Rebecca Foster, a child psychiatrist affiliated with Lurie Children's Hospital, had been brought in to address what she diagnosed as severe PTSD with selective mutism. Her $40,000 treatment plan included a cocktail of medications designed to regulate Ethan's anxiety and depression, along with weekly cognitive therapy sessions. The medications had turned Ethan into a zombie, physically present but emotionally unreachable. His natural personality buried under layers of pharmaceutical intervention that made him compliant but not healed. Dr. Jennifer Park's art therapy approach had cost $50,000 and focused on helping Ethan express his trauma through creative mediums when words seemed impossible. She'd filled Thomas's home office with easels, paints, clay, and musical instruments, creating a therapeutic environment designed to unlock emotional expression through artistic creation. Ethan had produced artwork that Dr. Park found therapeutically significant, dark, angry scribbles that she interpreted as representations of his internal state. But the art sessions had become another source of performance anxiety for a child who felt constantly evaluated and analyzed. Dr. Alex Rodriguez, the cognitive behavioral therapy specialist, had been Thomas's final attempt at professional intervention. His $50,000 program focused on helping Ethan develop coping strategies and reframe his traumatic memories through age-appropriate cognitive techniques. The CBT approach had lasted 2 months before Dr. Rodriguez gently suggested that Ethan might benefit from residential treatment. Acknowledging that outpatient therapy wasn't providing the breakthrough the family desperately needed. If you've ever struggled with trauma or watched someone you love suffer, you'll understand this father's desperation. Thomas Walsh had exhausted the most respected trauma specialists in Chicago, spent $250,000 on evidence-based treatments, and watched his son retreat further into himself with each failed intervention. Standing in his office on a cold February evening, watching Ethan arrange and rearrange the same set of building blocks with obsessive precision, Thomas felt the helplessness that no amount of wealth or influence could remedy. His pharmaceutical company had developed treatments that helped millions of people worldwide, but he couldn't find a way to help the one person who mattered most. The cleaning crew had arrived for their nightly routine, as they had every evening for the past 3 years. Thomas barely noticed them anymore, part of the invisible infrastructure that kept his business running smoothly while he focused on larger concerns. But that night, something different happened. As the cleaning cart squeaked softly down the hallway and the gentle sound of humming drifted through his office door, Ethan looked up from his blocks for the first time in hours. Nina Roberts had been cleaning office buildings for 15 years, but she'd been understanding trauma for much longer. The night shift at Walsh Pharmaceuticals paid better than her previous positions, and the work was steady, 2 qualities that mattered when you were a 52-year-old woman supporting yourself and trying to rebuild a life that had been shattered by violence. How many of us rushed to fix problems instead of just listening? Nina understood something most professionals miss, that healing rarely happened on anyone's schedule but the wounded person's own. Her background as a social worker felt like a lifetime ago, though it had only been 10 years since she'd left the profession that had defined her identity for 2 decades. She'd specialized in family trauma services, working with children who had witnessed domestic violence, survived abuse, or lost parents to addiction. Her case files had been filled with success stories, breakthrough moments, and families reconnected through her patient intervention. All of that expertise had felt meaningless the night her 17-year-old daughter Keisha was killed in a drive-by shooting, caught in crossfire while walking home from her job at a neighborhood grocery store. Nina's own trauma had made it impossible to continue helping other families navigate their crises when she couldn't find her way through her own grief. The social work techniques that had served her professionally felt hollow when applied to the devastation of losing a child to senseless violence. Working as a cleaning woman had been a form of healing, honest work that didn't require her to process other people's pain when her own felt unsurvivable. The night shift meant fewer interactions, less emotional demand, and the meditative rhythm of physical labor that helped quiet the constant ache of missing Keisha. But old instincts died hard. Even while emptying trash cans and vacuuming conference rooms, Nina couldn't stop noticing the signs of distress in the people around her. And over the past 6 months, she'd been increasingly concerned about the little boy who spent evenings in his father's office while expensive cars arrived and departed, delivering specialists who left behind more toys and fewer smiles. Ethan Walsh reminded Nina painfully of the children she used to counsel, the ones who survived violence by disappearing inside themselves, who learned that the world wasn't safe and that adults couldn't be trusted to protect them from harm. She'd never spoken directly to the child, maintaining the professional boundaries that kept cleaning staff invisible to the families they served. But she'd observed him during her nightly rounds, noting the hypervigilance that kept his shoulders tense and his eyes scanning for threats that might emerge from any direction. Nina recognized the signs because she'd lived them herself after Keisha's death. The inability to feel safe anywhere, the constant scanning for danger, the way trauma rewired your nervous system to expect catastrophe at any moment. On the February evening when everything changed, Nina was cleaning the reception area outside Thomas Walsh's office when she heard the familiar sounds of Ethan's evening ritual blocks being arranged with the kind of obsessive precision that trauma survivors often develop as a way of controlling their environment. Without thinking, Nina began humming one of the spirituals her grandmother had sung during her own childhood in Mississippi. The melody was something that had comforted her during the darkest months after Keisha's death, a wordless expression of sorrow and hope that seemed to acknowledge pain without trying to fix it. The sound of blocks stopped. Nina paused in her dusting, listening to the sudden silence from Thomas's office. After a few moments, she continued humming softly while she worked the melody flowing around her like a gentle current. "Excuse me?" came a small voice from the office doorway. Nina turned to find Ethan standing in the threshold, his dark hair falling across eyes that held the particular sadness of children who had learned too early that bad things happen to good people. "Is that a real song?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It is, baby," Nina replied gently, setting down her cleaning cloth and meeting his eyes with the kind of steady presence she'd once offered to frightened children in her social work practice. "My grandmother used to sing it when I was scared." "Are you scared now?" Ethan asked, stepping slightly closer. "Sometimes," Nina answered honestly. "But the song helps me remember that scared feelings don't last forever." Ethan considered this for a moment, then asked, "Can you sing it again?" Comment below if you've ever had someone who just listened to you without trying to solve everything. There's something magical about people who can sit with pain without rushing to make it disappear, isn't there? Nina resumed her humming, continuing her cleaning work, while Ethan stood in the doorway, listening. She didn't try to engage him in conversation, didn't ask questions about his feelings, didn't attempt any of the therapeutic techniques that his expensive specialists had employed. She simply offered her presence and her voice, creating a space where Ethan could exist without performance or expectation. Over the following weeks, their evening encounters became routine. Ethan would appear in his father's office doorway when Nina arrived for cleaning, listening to her quiet humming while she worked. Sometimes he would ask simple questions about the songs, about her work, about whether she had children of her own. Nina answered honestly, but briefly, never pushing for more interaction than Ethan offered, never trying to turn their conversations into therapy sessions. She'd learned from her own trauma that healing happened in relationship, not in isolation, and that the most powerful interventions were often the simplest ones. "My mom got hurt," Ethan told her one evening, the words emerging without preamble while Nina emptied his father's wastebasket. "That must have been very scary for you," Nina replied, her voice steady and calm. "It was," Ethan agreed. "The doctors keep asking me to talk about it, but I don't want to." "You don't have to talk about anything you don't want to talk about," Nina said simply. "Some things are too big for words anyway." Ethan nodded solemnly, seeming relieved to have someone acknowledge that silence could be its own form of communication. "Miss Nina," he said after a few minutes, "do you think sad feelings ever go away completely?" Nina paused in her work, considering how to answer a question that went to the heart of human resilience. "I think sad feelings change," she said finally. "They don't disappear, but they don't stay as sharp as they are right at the beginning, like how a hurt stops bleeding even though you can still see where it happened." Thomas Walsh, who had been listening from his desk chair, felt something shift in his understanding of what his son needed. For 6 months, he'd been seeking professionals who could eliminate Ethan's trauma specialists, who could return his son to the boy he'd been before the invasion. Nina wasn't trying to erase anything. She was simply offering Ethan permission to carry his pain without shame, to heal without pressure, and to trust his own timeline for recovery. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening in March when Thomas Walsh arrived at his office early and found Nina sitting on the floor beside Ethan, both of them working quietly on a jigsaw puzzle while she hummed softly. What happened next will change how you think about healing forever. Thomas's initial reaction was a mixture of panic and protectiveness. His traumatized son was interacting with an untrained employee who had no credentials, no insurance, and no authority to provide anything resembling therapeutic intervention. "Ethan, come here, please," Thomas said, his voice controlled but clearly tense. "Nina, I need to speak with you privately." Ethan looked between his father and Nina with the worried expression of a child who sensed conflict but didn't understand its source. "Did I do something wrong, Daddy?" "No, buddy, you didn't do anything wrong," Thomas assured him, though his eyes remained fixed on Nina with obvious concern. "Why don't you go to the conference room and work on your tablet while Nina and I talk?" After Ethan left, Thomas closed his office door and turned to face Nina with the kind of professional sternness that had intimidated board members and pharmaceutical executives throughout his career. "I appreciate your kindness to my son," he began, "but I need you to understand that Ethan is dealing with severe trauma that requires professional treatment. You're not qualified to provide therapy, and I can't have you interfering with his healing process." Nina listened quietly, her hands folded in front of her, her expression calm, despite the obvious tension in Thomas's voice. When he finished speaking, she nodded slowly. "Mr. Walsh," she said, "I'm not trying to provide therapy. I'm just trying to be present with a little boy who seems very lonely." "But you're encouraging him to talk about his trauma," Thomas insisted. "You're creating an emotional attachment that could interfere with his actual treatment." "What actual treatment?" Nina interrupted gently. "Mr. Walsh, with all due respect, your son has been seeing specialists for months, and he's not getting better. He's getting more withdrawn, more anxious, more afraid of the world around him." Thomas felt his anger flare at what seemed like criticism from someone who couldn't possibly understand the complexity of childhood trauma or the careful consideration that had gone into Ethan's treatment plan. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said sharply. "These are renowned specialists with decades of experience, and I'm sure they're very good at what they do," Nina replied, her voice remaining steady and respectful. "But sometimes what a hurting child needs isn't treatment. Sometimes they just need someone to witness their pain without trying to fix it." This breakthrough moment shows why sometimes the simplest approach is the most powerful. Thomas was about to respond when they heard Ethan's voice from the conference room, raised in obvious distress. Both adults rushed toward the sound and found Ethan having what appeared to be a panic attack, his breathing rapid and shallow as he rocked back and forth in his chair. Thomas immediately began implementing the coping strategies that Dr. Rodriguez had taught them. Deep breathing exercises, grounding techniques, reassuring words about safety and security. But Ethan's distress only intensified under the weight of structured intervention. "Ethan, honey," Nina said quietly, sitting down on the floor beside his chair without trying to touch him or direct his behavior. "I'm here. You're okay. You don't have to do anything except breathe." She began humming the same melody that had first drawn Ethan's attention months earlier, her voice creating a gentle current of sound that seemed to wrap around his panic like a warm blanket. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Ethan's breathing began to slow. His rocking decreased. His eyes, which had been squeezed shut in terror, opened and found Nina's face. "The bad men came back," he whispered, his voice breaking with the kind of pain that made both adults' hearts ache. "In my mind, they came back and hurt Mommy again." "That sounds very scary," Nina said simply, continuing to hum between words. "Your mind is trying to keep you safe by remembering the scary thing, but sometimes memories feel too real." "Wait until you hear what Ethan said. This is why I share these stories." "Miss Nina," Ethan said, tears streaming down his face, "why do the doctors want me to talk about the bad men?" Talking about them makes them feel more real. I don't know, baby, Nina replied honestly, but you don't have to talk about anything that makes you feel worse. Some hurts are too big for words anyway. Thomas watched this exchange with growing amazement and dawning recognition. For months, he'd been seeking professionals who could extract Ethan's trauma like a surgeon removing a tumor. But Nina wasn't trying to remove anything. She was simply offering Ethan permission to feel his feelings without judgment, to heal at his own pace, and to trust his own instincts about what felt safe and what didn't. Mr. Walsh, Nina said, turning to face him while keeping one hand near Ethan for comfort. Trauma isn't something you fix. It's something you learn to carry. And children learn to carry it best when they feel safe enough to feel their feelings without adults trying to make those feelings go away. But the specialists said, Thomas began, the specialists know a lot about trauma. Nina agreed. But they don't know your son. They don't know that he needs permission to be sad more than he needs techniques to stop being sad. They don't know that he's been performing recovery for months instead of actually healing. Thomas felt everything he thought he understood about helping his son shift beneath his feet. So what do I do? He asked, his voice breaking with months of accumulated frustration and fear. You listen, Nina said simply. You sit with him when he's scared without trying to make the fear go away. You let him know that it's okay to hurt, that healing doesn't mean forgetting, and that you'll be there no matter how long it takes. If you've ever doubted the power of simply being present, this will convince you. In that moment, Thomas Walsh finally understood the difference between treating trauma and witnessing it, between fixing a child and loving a child, between professional intervention and human connection. 6 months later, the 47th floor of Walsh Pharmaceuticals still gleamed with sterile perfection. But Thomas Walsh's office had been transformed into something that looked more like a family space than a corporate headquarters. Ethan's artwork covered one wall, not the dark, angry scribbles that had worried Dr. Park, but colorful drawings that showed a child beginning to rediscover joy and creativity. Nina had transitioned from night janitor to family support coordinator, a position that Thomas had created specifically to recognize her unique understanding of trauma-informed care. She spent her days helping other families navigate the complex world of childhood mental health, always emphasizing the power of presence over technique. Ethan still had difficult days. Trauma doesn't disappear, and healing isn't linear. But he'd learned to trust his own feelings, to ask for comfort when he needed it, and to understand that being hurt didn't mean being broken. Miss Nina, he said one afternoon while they worked on a puzzle together. Remember when you told me that sad feelings change like hurts that stop bleeding? I remember, Nina replied, watching him carefully place a corner piece. I think my hurt is like that now, Ethan said thoughtfully. I can still see where it happened, but it doesn't hurt sharp anymore. Thomas, listening from his desk, felt the same gratitude that had filled his heart every day since learning that healing didn't require expensive interventions. It required love, patience, and the courage to witness pain without trying to fix it. Which moment in this story resonated with you most? Share your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the most healing conversations happen when we share our experiences with others who understand. Nina Roberts proved something every parent and caregiver needs to remember. Children don't need us to take away their pain, they need us to help them feel safe enough to carry it. Trauma isn't solved by techniques or credentials. It's healed through relationships that offer unconditional presence and acceptance. Thomas Walsh learned that the most expensive treatment isn't always the most effective one, and that sometimes the most profound healing happens not in therapy offices, but in quiet moments when someone simply chooses to listen without judgment. If Nina and Ethan's story touched your heart and you'd like to hear more inspiring stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Every week I share stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Until next time, remember, the most powerful healing often happens not when we try to fix someone, but when we give them permission to feel safe exactly as they are.